Ruth Ryman. Ruth joins us as the City of Tucson's designated CART appointee. Ruth has been working very extensively with the city on their Complete Streets Committee and has been very involved in their Move Tucson process as well. Ruth also is a PAG alumni, so having retired from our organization a number of years ago after having been in overseeing the rideshare program and a lot of other mobility programs. And with that, Madam Chair, we're ready to commence our meeting.
Okay. We'll begin with the approval of the committee meeting minutes for January 29th. It's been a while since we've met. So, go ahead. Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Right, motion.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Great.
On to committee reports.
Okay, Madam Chair, we have a number of committee reports to give this afternoon. First, the Executive Committee has not met. The Annual Report Subcommittee has not yet, but we are in the midst of preparing the annual report and we'll begin with the Annual Report Subcommittee. And I would remind you that the Executive Committee serves as the Annual Report Subcommittee. The Uniform Mitigation Subcommittee had no action, nor did the Corridor Planning Subcommittee. The Nominating Subcommittee also did not have any action, but we will be needing to form a new nominating subcommittee to recommend officers for the 2022 slate of officers. I'd remind you that it is the chair's prerogative to appoint the members to the annual or to the nominating subcommittee. We did form a new subcommittee called the Project Scope and Funding Subcommittee, and they met one time on August 24th. The RTA issued a notice of funding availability in late July, and at the August 24th meeting, the Project Scope and Funding Committee considered the 4 funding requests in response to that notice of funding availability. And there was a motion made and approved that the 4 specific NOFA responses be presented to the RTA board with documentation to confirm that they are eligible RTA costs and within the scope of the voter approved plan, and that there is demonstrated justification for the need to exceed the expenditures that were outlined in the voter approved RTA plan, statutes and policies. And that any future funding requests are also analyzed under these same standards so that they are confirmed to be eligible RTA costs within the scope, and that there's a justification for the need to exceed the ballot amount of RTA funding. That motion was made by Mr. Huffman and seconded by Mr. Oliva, and it was approved unanimously. And Madam Chair, that concludes the committee reports.
Okay, are there any questions for Mr. DeGrood?
Yeah, I have a couple. I've done a lot of reading in preparation, so I'm curious as to how and why that committee was created. It seems to be new and different in the process, and I haven't seen any documentation that CART's been involved in programming supplemental funds for cost overruns. So could you explain to me how that committee was created and why, and how the members were chosen?
Certainly, Madam Chair, Ms. Ryman. The committee was formed at the board chair's discretion, which she has the authority to do. It was in response to the emerging requests for additional funding. We had not in the past exceeded the amount of funding within the RTA allocation on prior projects. And so as we're faced with increasing costs, this was a committee to review the requests and to confirm that it was proper to bring these forward before the RTA board. So I don't know, Mr. Mogimi, if you want to add anything to that, but that's in essence what the purpose of the committee was. And
so item 6 is actually talking more in detail about that. So
again, I'm sorry, item 6?
Item 6, yeah. So we'll talk more at that time.
Okay, because it seems kind of out of the norm where the tip usually is the one that reviews the NOFAs, and that has been historically the process that I saw in the reports I read. So I'm kind of concerned that you now seem to circumvent the tip process for cost overruns.
Madam Chair, Ms. Ryman, it's not a matter of circumventing the tip so much as giving the process the authority and being overseen by the oversight committee, the RTA CART committee, which is serving in that oversight function. So we wanted to make sure that we gave the opportunity to the committee to begin looking at these requests.
But what's different in 2021? We've
This
had
is
overruns before, so what's different in 2021?
we've not had overruns before. There have been other
With
sources.
the audit report shows 8 out of the 10 projects had overruns.
The project report that I believe you're looking at looks at using other sources of funding
Right.
other than RTA funds. This would be the first time we would be pledging or utilizing RTA funds for that purpose.
But you used regional money to cover overruns previously.
Regional monies have been used by other jurisdictions in the past to cover additional expenses, yes.
Are there any other questions? Moving on to the RTA Board Report.
Okay. There we go. Madam Chair, the board has met now 5 times since the last time that the CART met. I know we had tried to have a meeting that in September that didn't meet quorum requirements, but we've had 2 meetings since that time. But we met, the RTA board met in study session to discuss policy issues in April. In May, the RTA board approved a number of project agreements, including agreements for Sunset Road and Ruthroff Road for funding. Approved the budget for fiscal 22, which basically looked at the new revenues and new expenditures. The TIP had already been approved by PAG Regional Council at earlier in that day, where we funded all projects to the RTA ballot level. As a part of the budget, we identified approximately $30 million of funding that was available this fiscal year that could be brought to bear on additional requests. And that was the purpose of the NOFA. That was the basis for the NOFA being released. The board also reappointed the members of the Citizens Advisory Committee looking at RTA Next. Those members that were still with the committee and wanted to continue on. I believe there were 22 of them. In August, the RTA board met and discussed RTA plan requirements and CAC membership, looking at whether or not they would want to begin adding additional members to the CAC. In September, after the end of the fiscal year had been closed out, we did a revised budget, including the costs, rolling over the additional funds, revenues, and additional expenditure commitments from the fiscal 21 budget that had not been realized. There was an analysis or presentation on the cost to complete and potential fund sources. The CART committee members, 9 members, were reappointed to terms that will end with the end of the current RTA on September or on June 30th, 2026, and appointed Ms. Ryman at that same meeting for the same period or same term. And in October, the RTA board met again, approved transit IGAs, a process for appointing RTA members, and heard the financial forecast you'll be hearing momentarily.
Does anyone have any questions for Mr. DeBrood? Okay, moving on to item 5, RTA Financial Update.
Okay, Madam Chair, members of the CART committee, what I'm going to do is give you a presentation on how our funds have been, how we've been receiving funds in light of the pandemic. We also went out to the Eller College Economic Business and Research Center and asked for a forecast looking out 30 years. This would be useful to inform us what we might expect over the remaining balance of the RTA, and then give some information that the CAC can use in terms of looking at what we might receive if a half cent were extended beyond the 2026 current end of the RTA. So first, let's look at what happened last year. In terms of revenue, we had at the outset of fiscal 21, we were very concerned that there would be a steep decline in revenues associated with the pandemic. We took our estimate that we had from Eller College. The most recent one at that point in time was done in 2019. And we deflated our estimate by 15%, came up with a budget figure of $77.7 million. And that's what we used as our budget for fiscal 21. It was a significant drop from the prior fiscal year, where we had actually collected in fiscal 20, $89.2 million. In fact, we saw, rather than a steep decline, we saw a rather large increase in revenue that came into us in fiscal 21, with every single month showing positive growth over the year prior, and even more growth relative to the deflated budget, if you will. So we finished fiscal 21 with 11.7% year-over-year growth. We had a total of $99,684,182 that came in through TPT during fiscal 21. Looking to the, whoops, I thought there was another slide in there for, there will be later. Anyway, this graph shows how our collections have been going. We most recently took a deposit, actually we took a deposit today. I haven't had an opportunity to look at it. But our most recent deposit prior to today's was in October. And it represents collections that took place at the cash register, if you will, during the month of August. When transactions occur in August, it's remitted to the state in September, and in October we get a check. So it's kind of a 2-month lag to what's happened in the economy. So what happened in August of last year was we saw a pretty substantial amount of money coming in, $88.99 million. It was quite a bit larger than the year prior, and it was larger still than the October of 2020 or 2020. I'm sorry, October 2019. Prior to the pandemic, we had received during the month of October $7.38 million. So there's a big bump in there. Wanted to look at some other parts of our economy that we're looking at. One is, I know this is near and dear to Ms. Traficante's heart, what's going on in what I term hospitality related TPT. What it includes is bars and restaurants, amusements, and transient lodging. That's what we group together in this hospitality group. And this shows how we've performed over the last 6 years. Usually peaks in March, typically with spring visitation. And we saw a record in bar and restaurant sales in March of 2019. That record has been beaten. It was beaten in May. And we are looking at a recovery that is uneven in the various groups within the hospitality related group. Where we had seen them all kind of moving together in unison, we're seeing it breaking up a little bit, with bar and restaurant sales being much stronger than the transient lodging and amusements, which still are somewhat depressed. Amusements, just by way of information, is largely dominated by concerts and movies, and so that's still pretty weak, although it has recovered somewhat. And then transient lodging is the other component of that. Something else we've been looking at is what's happening in the retail world. I think we all kind of have been hearing about the bricks and mortar retailers not collecting as much as they had in years past, or not growing at the rate that internet trade has. And one of the things we've been looking at is this grouping. We call it's that the state collects them as remote retail and marketplace facilitated retail. And this shows pre-pandemic and post-pandemic sales trends. And it was really timely that the Supreme Court found that remote sales were taxable. That's why you only see this series beginning in October of 2019. It's because it was prior to that, we were not collecting uniformly remote sales. And now that we are collecting them, we've seen a big bump post-pandemic. And we're right now collecting 500,000 or more a month in these retail sales that are collected remotely. It represents roughly 8 to 9% monthly of our retail. Now, this is where we stand in the current fiscal year. We've now completed basically a third of the fiscal year. We have 4 months under our belt. Our fiscal 21 actuals are reported again against that $99.7 million total that we collected last year. For fiscal 22, we adopted a budget for revenue that was less than what we had collected, but it was in line with our prior Eller revenue estimate of $94.4 million. Year to date, we've done quite well. We've collected thus far a little over $36 million. That's year-over-year growth of 13.2% and 19.5% growth relative to our budget for revenue. Now I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about our longer term forecasts. Back in 2005, we did a forecast for the RTA prior to the vote. We expressed it in 2006 dollars. But when these forecasts are done, they're done in nominal dollars, year of collection dollars, including inflation. What we do is we then deflate them down to the current year or a specific year so that we can put it in the terms of the current cost estimates that we're seeing on construction and the like, assuming that the costs would go up together, both construction and revenue. So our original forecast was done in 2005, and it anticipated about $2.8 million nominally, which we deflated to $2.1 billion, which is what was in the RTA plan. When we did it back in 2006, we looked at a high growth scenario and a low growth scenario, and we picked the middle growth scenario at that point in time. In 2010, after the recession had been fully felt, we did another very brief forecast. It was a cursory one, and that one we only looked at the baseline. And at that point in time, we were estimating that the RTA in nominal dollars would collect about $2.1 billion over the life of the RTA plan. We then did additional forecasts in 2013, where we first saw a really big drop. And then in 2017 and 2019, we did forecast updates. The 2017 forecast showed an even greater decline than the 2013 forecast had. By 2019, we saw a slight improvement, but it was still less than the 2013 forecast. We are now looking at a forecast that was done after we had begun to see the impact of the stimulus that had been provided to the economy. It has a set of expectations that includes a tapering off of stimulus revenues following the pandemic. So This bar chart shows the difference between the different forecasts that we've had in the past. The blue bar first let me point out to the orange bar, the tall bar. That was that represents what our forecast was back in 2006. These are in nominal dollars, so they included inflation. And the next thing I'd like to point to you is the bar that's immediately to the left of the orange bar. That's the actual amount that we collected. So the first year we started slow, was in part because we only had 10 months of collection. But in 2008, we were pretty close to what we had forecast. And then we had the recession. And at that point in time, we saw a pretty steady drop off in revenue. So you can see we bottomed out basically in 2010 and then began slowly climbing out of the recession. It was a very slow climb compared to the rest of the nation and slower than previous recession recoveries. We did the 2013 estimate, which is the green bar immediately to the right of the orange bar. You can see it as you look out further to the right. You can see that it's actually higher than the other bars, the succeeding later forecasts. And we're showing the forecast for 2017 in yellow and in pale blue the 2019 forecast. Now, for the new revenue estimate, I want to talk a little bit about how we do estimates. First, we always look out at least 30 years. And we know that really what we're looking at is growth and overall changes in the tax base, things that we think are likely and how it'll impact our revenue in the long term. We use a national data set, or actually the Eller Economic Business and Research Center uses a national data set from a group called IHS Market. And then they use local and statewide information that they develop through their forecasting project. You may hear about statewide forecasts. They do forecasts for the Phoenix metro area, they do statewide forecasts, and they do forecasts for the Tucson metro area. And we take from that product our forecasts. We do a baseline forecast, and then we also look at an optimistic and a pessimistic forecast. So we kind of get a bracket of where we think we're going to end up. And we also, for this particular forecast, deflated it down to 2022 dollars so that it could be useful when we're looking at a future project set for perhaps RTA Next. The estimate also acknowledges the impact of the pandemic being short-term, and it anticipates a return to pre-pandemic trends after the impact of the stimulus wanes. So I apologize in advance. I'm kind of a graph guy, so you'll be seeing a lot of graphs over the next few minutes. But this is the total estimated tax base for the RTA. That's the amount that we're taxing against. So we look at basically $20 billion or close to $20 billion. We take 0.5% of that. It's $1 billion, or it's 100 million. And that's about what we collected last year. So that's that is the bar on your right. It's in millions of dollars, and it is in actual dollars collected. So you can see, beginning back in the 80s, we had a fairly steady trend going up into the beginning of the Great Recession. It was based upon that trend that those forecasts for the RTA were done back in 2006. You can see that with the Great Recession, we took we had a huge offset, and an offset much greater than we had seen associated with 9/11 in the past, or probably the most recent prior recession that we would think of would be that associated with the S&L failures back in 89-90, when we had Resolution Trust Corporation and everything kind of slowed down. That's that far left gray bar that you see there is associated with that. But the impact of the Great Recession was pretty staggering. And there are some things that we've seen in terms of fundamental changes in our economy that happened with that. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So one of the things that I always like to do is then look at it in terms of inflation adjustments. And this is that same forecast adjusted to reflect inflation and expressed in current year dollars. So if you look at our tax base with the stimulus that we just have been receiving has finally returned to about what it was equivalent in 2008, prior to the Great Recession. We saw a big drop in the tax base between 2007 and 2011, and we'd only been recovering at about 1.4% per year. Again, we saw a big spike up in 2021. In terms of what it is on a per capita basis, though, and they don't have the last year, the tick up at the end there for 2021 on this particular graph because they didn't have data for it. But this shows the per capita inflation adjusted tax base. So we are still quite a bit lower than we were in 2008 in terms of the per capita tax base when you adjust it all for inflation. One of the most significant portion or reasons for this change has been a shift in our consumption patterns. And this has been something I've spoken about in the past, but what we have been seeing is an ongoing shift as we age, our consumption patterns change. And one of the things that has been, what the Pima County is aging relative, aging over time, the average age of Pima County residents are. And one of the things that happens when you age is you consume more healthcare. And healthcare has been increasing in cost. So what you're seeing is a shift from buying goods to buying services, and the services are dominated by healthcare. And that's what you see in this particular graph of, when you look at Pima County's personal income and how much our tax base is of that, it has shrunk from, pre-pandemic or pre-Great Recession, it was about 45% of our residents' disposable income was part of our tax base. Now it's closer to 33%. And this is the long-term trend. You can see it to the left, a decline, but this is a long-term trend that we're seeing in society. And if you look at what we expect looking out the total length of the forecast out to 2051, we'll see that trend continue. And this is a trend, a national trend, not a local trend here. This is a national trend being expressed. Currently we're we have a little higher tax base as a percent of disposable income than the national is right now. And you can see that with the pandemic, we saw initially a drop in consumption, and then it spiked with increased with the stimulus payments. And we're going to see that for a little while longer, and then it's going to begin to taper off, and we'll show you that in a moment. But ultimately, it will continue on this down slope towards reduced consumption of goods, increased consumption of services with our disposable income. Now, this is looking at our nominal disposable income growth looking forward. You can see to the left side of the chart, our history. To the right is what the forecast is. And you can see in 2020, 2021, the growth is high. We're seeing a lot of increase in wages right now, and we've seen the stimulus. But we expect that as that stimulus wanes, we'll actually see a bit of negative growth. Well, it'll be short, it'll only be for 1 year, and then we'll settle into a trend of about a 4% annual growth. And again, this includes inflation. When we look at our revenue projection, again, this is nominal dollars, so it includes inflation on a year-to-year basis. We'll see our revenue grow from about 99.7 million, which is what we collected in 2021, on up to approximately 246 million by 2051. And that's the baseline scenario, a baseline estimate. This is what the growth rate looks like on an annual basis. Again, we'll be, we're in a high growth right now. We expect that to taper off and go basically flat next year or two, and then return to a steady growth of about 3% annually. That, again, nominal dollars, so it's inclusive of inflation. And so one of the things that we do is we look at this revenue projection that is, now this is in nominal dollars, so it's inclusive of inflation. We look at an optimistic, which is the short dashed line. You've got your baseline, which is the red line, and then you've got our pessimistic forecast. And then that's the bottom line, the one that's got the dots in it. And the pessimistic forecast is kind of interesting in that it actually crosses the baseline in the out years. And the reason for that is that in the pessimistic forecast, there is a presumption of a greater rate of inflation. So that's why it crosses the baseline. So what we want to do then is we want to look at it in terms of 2022 dollars. What are we looking at on a going forward basis? So in 2022 dollars, we would expect a fairly shallow growth rate on the baseline. And if we were to look at the pessimistic forecast, we'd actually see it rise slightly and then decline as we're going up towards 2051. So it's kind of a flat line of what we're currently collecting would be the pessimistic forecast if we were to look at that. And I think that's a question that, as the board and the CAC are contemplating what the size of the issue might be or the projects might be, that's something that we'll need to inform them this forecast. And so next steps, this estimate's available for us to estimate the likely revenue available for the RTA to complete the RTA 2006 plan. That new baseline that we've got shows it's collecting about $60 million more than we thought we were going to collect in our last forecast. So there is some additional funds that we're going to be looking at being able to make available, or we expect to be able to make available for project funding needs going forward. And it also helps us with trying to understand what we might expect for the future RTA plan, which could be in the $2 to $2.3 billion range at the current half-cent rate. And with that, Madam Chair, that's my long-winded, graph-intense, hope I didn't put you to sleep presentation.
Are there any questions for Mr. DeGrood?
I will be asking questions. So in all the projections, you've included inflation on the revenue side, but none of the project costs have included inflation from 2006. Why is that?
Well, we have not been able to adjust to incorporate additional revenues due to inflation because we are actually collecting less than we had forecast at the baseline level. So what we did initially was we programmed to the ballot amount, and as monies are available, we'll be looking to program them to meet the needs of those projects.
That you're telling me all the projections here included inflation, but the money being used in the RTA plan is not inflated.
That's correct. The RTA plan, when we budgeted in the TIP process, and we'll talk about that in a minute on the next slide, but next presentation. But this is looking exclusively at the revenue side. We'll talk about the costs separately, and
okay.
And
So
we
you
do
want me to-
acknowledge that there's inflation.
I'm sorry.
We acknowledge that there is inflation.
Okay, because what I saw in the code is that the costs of the projects were to be updated on an annual basis to reflect inflation. Has that ever been done along the way?
We've not increased the funding available because we haven't had it available to provide.
No, I
The
asked if
answer is
costs
no.
have-
We've not made an adjustment.
Okay, so you haven't done adjustments because there's no additional funding.
We've actually had to look for funding to meet the needs that were in the plan. Yes.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any questions? Moving on to item 6.
Okay. All right. I've got there's a couple of presentations in here, so
Okay.
we'll go through a number of them. And I know that there were some materials that we provided to you in your packets. Let's go ahead and start with this. This is mirroring material that was provided to the RTA board or provided to the RTA board. I know we did not have the most recent presentation given to the RTA board. We provided it to them separately because the meeting ended short or ended long. It was a long meeting. They didn't get to all of the items in the agenda. But this is a distribution of funding. When you look at the RTA roadway element, one of the questions that we had raised of us was, how does this break out amongst the jurisdictions? And so we've given you a pie chart showing, based on frontage foot, equally distributing the costs across the frontage for each jurisdiction, based upon their current jurisdictional boundaries, the funds that are in the RTA roadway element. And I can provide a greater detail for that if you'd like. But this is the distribution. You can see about 61.75% of the funds are being expended within the corporate limits of the city of Tucson. The next highest number would be Pima County unincorporated with 23.43%, and then Marana at 9.61%, and Salrita and Oro Valley in the 2-ish range. That's just the roadway element. Now, when we look at total reimbursements, and this is what we've spent, what we've paid out to the jurisdictions in reimbursement requests since the onset or since the beginning of the RTA board and through the end of fiscal year 20. And this does not include monies that we paid directly to ADOT, does not include debt service. There was one project that was delivered by the city of Tucson that was in kind of transition from Pima County. We ended up doing the design on it, and then the city executed the construction. The design component of it came through the RTA, so it's not included in this. We also are not including the wildlife overpass and the wildlife projects within this, legal expenses and our administration. But the amount of money that has gone out to the jurisdictions in the way of checks, that's what this represents. And it's about not quite 760 million through the end of fiscal 20. The city of Tucson's about 58% of that. In terms of where we are today, one of the things that I wanted to make sure that that y'all knew is we did, or the TIP was adopted as we presented to the CART committee back in January. We were proposing to fully fund to the ballot level within the TIP all of the remaining RTA roadway element projects, and that took place. And so we're meeting the voter obligation to fund to that minimum level now. And due to the Great Recession, we had to pledge all of the other federal and state obligation, or state and federal funds from the period of fiscal 2020 to fiscal 2026 to meet the obligations of the programming to the ballot level. In terms of where we are today with respect to costs, we had done our own independent estimate of construction costs. Looking at that versus the revenues that we currently believe available, we identified a gap in funding of between 88 million and 131 million dollars. So that's funding that we're going to need to fund. Though that we acknowledge that costs have increased since the original ballot levels were established on cost estimates in 2006. We know that there are unforeseen costs that we've had to deal with. I know archaeology, right-of-way, railroad, those have all been costs that we've had to incur that were not contemplated to the extent that that we've seen them. And we also acknowledge that there are a number of projects that are currently being built or designed with scopes that are greater than what was in the RTA plan. For instance, Houghton Road has a 3-lane or a 6-lane section proposed from basically Broadway to the south. The RTA plan did not include more than 4 lanes south of Rita Ranch or north of Golf Links. So anything outside of that is additional scope. We also are now looking at Sunset Road. Sunset Road is being proposed with a grade separation. When we funded it back in 2000 to put the plan together back in 2006, we looked at overpass, we looked at grade. We couldn't afford the overpass, so we put it in the plan with an at-grade crossing with a 3-lane cross section both east and west of the interstate. It's now infeasible to do an at-grade railroad crossing because of the regulatory environment we're now in. So it is being currently designed in conjunction with ADOT with an overpass over the railroad and a matching overpass over the interstate. So that's what's currently in design, but it costs more than the original allocation. So those are in the cost range that we're currently showing of 88 to 131 million dollars that we need to fund. This is over and above the most recent revenue estimate that we have. And so when you look at the 131 million, that's going to be against our optimistic revenue estimate. The 88 million is against our baseline revenue estimate. And here are those estimates. When we did the TIP initially, we had an estimate of $97.1 million and of funding that was not committed. This would be going back to when we were talking back in January. Baseline estimate that was approved in the TIP and with the amended budget brings that up to $148 million of uncommitted resources. And that includes the windfall that we saw last year, as well as the increase from pessimistic to baseline. We now have a new forecast that ups that baseline estimate to $204.5 million of uncommitted funds. Those are funds over and above what we put into the TIP to meet the ballot level. And we also did an optimistic forecast, which looks at some additional growth in the revenue from TPT. It also restores HERF 12.6 or HERF funding to their pre-pandemic levels. And we have reason to believe that will likely happen. HERF money is coming in at a higher rate than we had forecast a year ago. Those were also reduced with the pandemic. So we're looking right now using our baseline of $204.5 million of uncommitted funds to an upset limit or an upper limit of $247.3 million in a more positive or more optimistic forecast. So that's how we arrived at that range of 88 million to 131 million dollars. There are other funds that we can look at. local impact fees, those were certainly affected by the Great Recession, although we've been able to bring most of those dollars in. There still are some funds that we don't have fully funded at the 2006 levels in terms of the commitments for impact fees. We're also going to need to look at the HERF and other local general funds that may or may not be available. But right now, those would be over and above that $204 to $247 million range. We have to recognize that the jurisdictions are responsible for providing local funds to meet any costs that exceed what's in the ballot. We have funds that we can bring to bear on it, but they are their roads, and our policies do identify the jurisdictions as being the responsible party for the delivery of these projects. We certainly can make these funds available. The funds that we have available it will be a board decision as to how those are provided to the jurisdictions for meeting those needs. There are additional sources of funding that we do expect that will be available. Certainly the local agencies can bring additional funds to bear, particularly if they're looking for enhancements, additional lanes, additional features. The additional RTA revenues that, based upon what we collect, we can make available. There are also additional state and federal dollars for the region. I know the town of Oro Valley was successful in securing $6 million for Tangerine Road. There are other opportunities out there to acquire state and federal funding. We know that that there are federal, state, and earmarks available. With the passage of the new infrastructure bill, I think that's something that we need to look towards finding if there are funds that can be directed to meeting these needs. Again, the direct state allocation, as I mentioned, that the town of Marana did, and then future RTA Next revenues could be considered, particularly if a jurisdiction wants to do something over and above what was stated in the RTA plan. There's one particular project on the southeast side that we've had conversations about, where a bridge over the Pantano Wash that was 2 lanes in the RTA plan. The community really believes that a 4-lane road widening from for a mile or 2 is more appropriate and in demand, and that may be something that we look at with future funds from the next RTA. And in terms of next steps, we do want to bring the project task force back together again. The RTA TMC had an ad hoc committee, they called it the Project Review Task Force, that looked at individual projects. One of the things that they did was they confirmed that the projects that were moving forward were consistent with scope, and they did recommend that additional funds be brought to bear on certain projects. They also can help us in terms of confirming whether or not scope expansions are needed and looked at from an outside set of eyes there. They've also made some recommendations in terms of things that could be done differently. We will be looking at, in fact, are currently looking at the project cost estimates. One of the things that we don't really want to get into, but find ourselves in sometimes, is dueling cost estimates, where the jurisdiction says something, the RTA says something else. We can get together and agree on some costs, and we've been working to do that. And that's something that I hope to be able to present shortly. We're escalating through our respective organizations these cost estimates. We need to look at very critically at project features that aren't eligible for RTA funding. Some by statute, some by rules. There are some things that are kind of sore spots. I know that utility costs are something that are subject to an agreement between the city and the county dating back to 1979 that we aren't party to, but do have some impact on on the jurisdictions that are trying to deliver these projects. There are also certain expectations not to exceed, if you will, on things like landscaping and art and things like that. And they're great to have in the projects. We support having these, high quality landscaping, lots of art in these projects, but to a point. And if we hit that point and the jurisdiction still wants to go beyond it, that should be self-funded. Finally, we will be continuing to annually evaluate where we are revenue-wise. I think that's the only way we can do this. We also know that these costs are not fixed. They're not chiseled in stone either. So costs will be volatile. We expect them probably to go up, but in some cases they may go up and then down again. Depends on what happens with the various trades and supplies. We know right now there is movement in the petroleum costs. There's movement in a lot of the supplies as well. So, and labor is certainly something that we're always aware of and seems to be going up at a higher than average rate right now. So these are things we're going to need to look at. With that, that's the end of that presentation, and I'll go into. Tell you what, if it's all right with you, Madam Chair, with your sufferance, if I could go into the next presentation and handle all the questions at one time, if that'll work. Unless there's something really burning.
Well, we'll have questions. You can do whatever you want. I'll ask them at the end.
Fair enough. All right, moving on. One of the things we want to talk about is, kind of our funding requirement framework. We do have projects that we have in the past disallowed some costs on. There are optional items where they've gone beyond the scope of the project that is stated in the plan. We have POPs that back that up. We also have funding caps on certain projects that have been exceeded in the past. Design, public art, and landscaping are ones that we've had some trouble with in the past. We've generally been able to work it out, but these were areas that were a problem in the past. And as I mentioned earlier, utility relocation expenses that aren't associated with prior rights are basically to the jurisdictions to work out with the providers in the area. One thing that we have also noticed is that where we have had a road project that's been coupled with drainage, we've looked at trying to work with the flood control district on dealing with that. I think that's a project or an issue that we're working out on downtown links currently. Regional Flood Control District is bringing some funds to bear on the large storm drain system that's being installed. That storm drain is taking a large portion of the north side of downtown out of the 100-year floodplain. So that's really not an RTA mission, but it's something that is appropriately done in conjunction with this project. And it's appropriately funded partially by the Flood Control District. I think I touched on that on the drainage. One thing that we know happens, and there was a policy approved by the CART committee and then by the RTA board that basically says that if there is a major redesign, because a jurisdiction decides to do something differently than what they had been designing, that's fine, but it's we would only pay for the design one time. So if they want to redesign it, that's fine, but go ahead and do that, but we're not going to reimburse the expense of the redesign effort. Additional project costs that are due to increases in scope. Basically, if the jurisdiction wants to do something that goes beyond the scope of the RTA plan, they're welcome to do that. We encourage them to do that, but they have to bring funds to bear on that. Bring their own funds. Also, if they want to decrease the scope of a project, that's fine, so long as it doesn't decrease the functionality of the project. And that was an RTA board resolution that was done even before the vote. It was one adopted by the board to reassure the public at the time that we wouldn't be changing the plan. and reducing things in the future. At least not without giving consideration to the reason it was put into the plan and not diminishing that expected functionality. There also is in statute a requirement that once a project for which RTA monies are expended is built, it is the responsibility of the jurisdiction that built the project to maintain it. And that's, I've cited the section of ARS that relates to that. For those costs that are beyond what's in the RTA plan, the RTA board can approve supplemental funding for eligible costs. So when we're talking about this inflation, there's no prohibition from them or prohibition that they have to, or that they cannot fund increases. They can fund increases due to inflation to the extent that we have funds to do so. And that any amendment to augment funds will have to be done through an intergovernmental agreement. And that's just our standard course of business. And that allows us to legally make that commitment for that change. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Anyone have any questions at this time?
Or anyone other than me? 'Cause
Well, you're new, so.
I'll ask some questions. Could you go back to the chart with the projections for revenue, that 97 million, 200 million?
I
I want to
try.
make sure I understand what that is.
Okay. That one?
So you're
Okay.
projecting that there's 130 million uncovered increases in costs, supplemental funds needed.
Okay.
And I'm seeing here an estimate of $204 million in uncommitted funds.
Correct.
So
That-
that sounds like you got enough money.
No, actually, if we were to apply the $204 million, we would have a gap of 131 million.
Oh, so
But
that
we still have to
130 is
find.
after this.
Correct. If we
Oh.
apply the 247 million to it, then we have $88 million. So it's the same cost we're applying, depending upon what the revenue is that we've got available, and we apply it all to meeting those costs, we still have a gap.
Okay, now I understand that better. Okay. So given that the city is talking about a $250 million difference, there's a lot of money
Okay.
needed.
Madam Chair, I've just been informed that we've lost our quorum.
We did lose our quorum,
Oh,
so we
I
can't
think
vote
we
on
cannot have a-
anything.
We have to adjourn the meeting.
We have to
if you
adjourn the
don't-
meeting, but I'm happy to stand by and answer your questions.
Could we talk?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, well, no quorum. I will now adjourn the meeting. And we will be sending out information we'll need to be sending out information for a nominating committee, correct?
Please
Okay.
join in.
And then the annual report committee. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.
Yeah.